Darth Vader vents. That's the headline of Maureen Dowd's New York Times column on Dick Cheney's new book. She says Cheney veers unpleasantly between spin, insisting he was always right, and score settling, insisting that anyone who opposed him was wrong. Two of the people who opposed him, Valerie Plame and Joe Wilson, join me in a last word exclusive. Then later, the U.S. has killed Al-Qaeda's #2 operative. Again. That's ahead in the rewrite.
The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
In his new book, In My Time, available to the gullible in bookstores tomorrow, former Vice President Dick Cheney says that the Bush administration had no reason to apologize for using those 16 words in President Bush's 2003 State of the Union address to help justify the war in Iraq to the American people. 5 months after President Bush said those 16 words, former U.S. Ambassador Joe Wilson called them into question. Wilson, who as an envoy investigated firsthand Niger's suspected link to Iraq's weapons program, wrote in the New York Times that, quote, some of the intelligence related to Iraq's nuclear weapons program was twisted to exaggerate the Iraqi threat. Wilson added, the day after the State of the Union speech, I reminded a friend at the State Department of my trip and suggested that if the president had been referring to Niger, then his conclusion was not borne out by the facts as I understood them. According to Cheney's new book, after Wilson's account appeared in the New York Times, the White House considered apologizing for the inclusion of the 16 words in the president's State of the Union address. Some on the president's senior staff believed that if we issued an apology, the story would go away. I strongly opposed the idea an apology would only fan the flames, and why apologize when the British had, in fact, reported that Iraq had sought a significant amount of uranium in Africa. The 16 words were true. 6 days after Wilson's account appeared in the New York Times, his wife, Valerie Plame, was outed as a CIA agent. Joining me now, former CIA officer Valerie Plame and her husband, former U.S. Ambassador Joe Wilson. Thank you both for joining me tonight.
Thank you for having us.
Good to be with you, Lawrence.
Condoleezza Rice realized sometime later that it was wrong for President Bush to include those 16 words, and here is Dick Cheney's account of what happened then. I was under the impression that the president had decided against a public apology and was therefore surprised a few days later when National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice told the White House press pool, we wouldn't have put it in the speech if we had known what we know now. Joe, should they have put it in the speech based on what they knew then, and then based on what they knew later?
Well, of course they should not have. And in fact, George Tenet had communicated to Condi Rice and Steve Hadley 3 times before a September speech in Cincinnati, telling them, do not use this Niger information. We don't believe it, and then articulated the reasons why they don't believe it. Indeed, just a couple of days after the President's State of the Union address, according to George Tenet's book, Mike Morrell, the presumptive deputy director of the CIA now, told one of Cheney's staffers, we're not going to use that in the Secretary's speech to the UN because we don't believe it. So they had lots of time, and it was never an apology, I don't think, that anybody needed out of an administration that was not prone to apologize in the first place. It was just an admission that they were wrong, which hopefully at that time would have encouraged the investigative journalistic press to look into other things that they might have misled the American public about.
I want to read you another passage from the book. This is Cheney after Condoleezza Rice's apology. He says, Rice realized sometime later that she had made a major mistake by issuing a public apology. She came into my office, sat down in the chair next to my desk, and tearfully admitted that I had been right. Now, in an interview with NBC's Jamie Gangel, Cheney defended his use of the word tearfully. Listen to this.
Was she crying?
She was tearful.
That's what I wrote. If I'd wanted to say she was crying, I would have said she was crying.
You know that tearfully is a loaded description for powerful women in high office. It's going to be seen by a lot of people as provocative. Could you have left that word out?
It is an accurate description of what happened and what I saw.
Valerie, I'm sorry to tell you that nowhere in the book could we find an account of anyone in the White House being tearful about the outing of a CIA agent. Are you surprised that there isn't a word of regret about that?
Could he have been any more patronizing or sexist than what he used? He did it on purpose, of course. He's wounding his former colleagues. He's shown nothing but contempt. And I think it is so ironic that for Dick Cheney, who touts his national security prominence and his expertise, he has never once accepted any responsibility nor regret for the outing, the betrayal of a CIA officer that was working on nuclear weapons, finding them, stopping them, the WMD in Iraq, and so forth.
Joe, I want you to listen to this passage of the book where Cheney says, despite what Joe Wilson was saying in the press, he had brought back information from Africa that supported the 16 words. Joe, what do you make of that?
Well, it's simply not true. What he's referring to is a 1999 meeting that took place in Algiers between the then foreign minister and an Iraqi delegation that was headed by the guy who later became known as Baghdad Bob, who had absolutely no connection to anything to do with Saddam's nuclear program then, before, or afterwards. The then foreign minister told me that when he was approached about taking the meeting, he immediately was concerned that perhaps the Iraqis might want to raise uranium, a subject about which he had no interest in discussing with them because of the UN sanctions and other UN activities related to uranium sales to a country like Iraq. And therefore, he told me he determined never to raise that question or never to discuss it. And in fact, he said, and I reported this, that the subject was never raised. So it is just a bald-faced lie.
Joe Wilson and Valerie Plame, please stay with us. We're going to take a break here. We're going to be back with more of your reaction to Dick Cheney's book and what he had to say about Scooter Libby. That's coming up. Stay with us.